This past week I've been throwing a variety of shapes, including these large lidded jar forms, dozens of these cylindrical store jars, and a few groups of these simple, quite narrow cylindrical vases, or bottles if you'd rather call them that. They were thrown on Monday and were then left to dry out until they were leather hard over a couple of days. This is the condition I want the clay to be in before I can trim the pots. Firm enough that the rim isn't distorted if I squeeze it gently. And if I run my fingertips over the clay, it should in no way dent or mark the stoneware. To attach this pot onto the wheel, I brush some slip around the outside of the base, place it onto the metal, and then rhythmically tap it until it spins perfectly in the middle, a process that's called tap centering, although how neatly your pot spins in the middle really depends on how evenly it's been thrown. I then use a kidney just to compress the lowest portion of the wall into the wheel head. I glide my fingers over the walls just to feel the cross section so I know roughly how much clay I can remove during this process, and then the trimming can begin. And for this first pass, I generally favour using the sharp corner of this tungsten carbide trimmer, which I hold really securely in my clasped right hand and then glide it down the wall of the pot at a steady, even rate, refining the shape and generally just removing weight from the walls of the pot. Usually by the time I reach the lower portion, I have to alter the grip I'm holding the trimmer with, and I even hold it with two hands in order to keep the blade as steady as possible as it tears through the leather hard clay. On the upward pass I change which part of the blade I'm using, and I press the straighter side of the metal into the clay to remove those more prominent gouges made in the first pass. And once again as my hands traverse the pot, you'll notice that both are helping guide the tool, and my left hand's thumb helps to keep the blade of the trimmer steady as it moves down in a vertical line. After the walls have been trimmed, you can see that they're covered in numerous lines that travel from top to bottom, and so, to remove the more prominent marks, I scrape over any surface that I trim with the flat edge of a metal kidney like this. With the lower walls complete, I can move on to trimming the shoulder, then the neck, and then the rim to some degree. It's a bit too rounded at this point for my liking, and I'd rather it bevels out to a much sharper edge, coming to a point on the outside of the wall, rather than concluding sort of in the middle of it as a rounded top. In a moment, when I stop the wheel, you'll see the surface looks sort of uneven. This effect is called chattering, and it can be done purposefully as a decorative feature, and it's caused by the turning tool used chattering or bouncing and skittering really across the surface as you trim. And if you do accidentally chatter a pot too much, it can be quite difficult to remove totally, and you do need to be careful, as if you just run another turning tool over those marks, you can just exaggerate them and make them worse. And so generally, the way I remove them is by using a much smaller turning tool, like this, to skim over the surface, and then I use a flat metal kidney just to scrape over the area and to make sure it's smooth. You'll feel it and hear it almost when the tool chatters, and it's a very common occurrence when using sharp tungsten carbide turning tools. And I've learnt to deal with it generally, and sometimes it's something I just let occur before fixing it afterwards. As my pots tend to have quite sharp, distinct angles in their form, the squared tip of this trimmer is extraordinarily useful for creating the corners where these angles change. And sometimes I'll even use the tip of my finger to support the very end of the blade as I use it. To trim the internal portion of the rim, I tend to use trimmers like this. These are looped stainless steel blades that aren't particularly sharp, which means they won't chatter on this internal surface, and as they aren't very sharp, there isn't too much of a chance that I'll accidentally trim away too much clay, as turning the pot from this angle can be quite tricky, so I like using a tool I have a lot of control over, as if I make a mistake at this point that ruins the rim of the pot, there's pretty much no going back, and no easy way to fix it. After the internal wall has been trimmed flat, I focus on beveling the rim so it comes to a much finer point, giving the pot the overall appearance of being very fine and light. The finer edge will also pierce the glaze that's coated over it more dramatically. And lastly, I compress the slightly rough top with the smooth side of a plastic kidney. And with the outer walls trimmed, the next step will be to remove the pot from the wheel, which I do using the tip of this sharp metal knife. I glide it underneath the pot, digging it beneath the area I slipped. And it's for this reason that I don't slip the entire underside of the pot, as I only have to slide the knife under a little bit, and not all the way to the centre. I then clean up any excess clay left on the wheel, as otherwise this stoneware would embed itself back into the rim I've just so carefully finished. The vase is then placed upside down and nudged into the centre. And then I gave the rim a quick blast using a heat gun, just to firm the stoneware up slightly, so that when I push these lumps of clay around the rim to secure it, they don't distort the clay work. And as I push them into place, I keep one hand held on the vase at all times, so that the vessel isn't knocked off centre as it's pinned in place. I then place a nylon spinner on top of the pot, which is a tool that has a ball bearing in between the black and white parts, and it's quite heavy, and through this I can apply quite considerable downward pressure, and this is just another layer of defence really, another tool to help keep the pot steady as I trim. You could very well just use your fingertips to push down with, but as the black area I'm pushing down against stays stationary, I feel like the pressure I can push down with is just much more secure, and there's much less of a chance of anything throwing me off. It can then be plucked away, revealing really quite a messy base. There's a few indentations and the linear marks left over from when the pot was wired off the wheel at the throwing stage, so I gently skim the tool over the bottom to make sure it's flat and to remove the worst of these marks. I then bevel the outer edge, and then for some of these larger pots, I've been trimming indented footwells into the bases. This way I'm retaining the initial thrown height of the pot, as well as creating some kind of decorative feature on the bottom of the piece. And if I'm able to turn them deep enough, I'll hopefully be able to glaze some of these trimmed feet too. To make sure I'm not trimming the base too thin, I'll periodically check the thickness by pressing it lightly with a thumb. If I feel it begin to bow inward ever so slightly, then I know it's time to stop trimming any further down. Trimming pots this high up is another challenge altogether, as I can't brace my arms into my torso or push them against the plastic wheel tray. So instead, I pin my elbows to my sides to keep the trimmer steady. And as the vase is only secured by 3 lumps of soft clay, my trimming at this point is all quite timid. And what I mean by that is I'm never applying too much pressure with the tools I use, as if one catches this high up, the entire vase can easily be pulled to one side, distorted and potentially destroyed. This is my hand-carved porcelain stamp, my maker's mark, and the symbol I impress into all of my pots to show that they were made by my hands. And speaking of by my hands, thank you so much to everyone who's pre-ordered a copy of my book so far. It means the absolute world to me. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll leave some links down in the description below that should give you all the information you need to know. As the clay on the freshly trimmed foot is still quite soft, I give it a quick blast with the heat gun to try it out before removing the pot and flipping it over onto its base. This way the grain of the wood on my wearboards doesn't imprint itself into the leather hard clay. Once flipped over, I did a minor bit of correcting to the rim. I hold the rubber kidney and push it out ever so slightly, just to make sure the top of this pot is nice and round. And then I gave the walls one quick scrape, just to remove any burrs of clay on the walls or any marks left by my fingers. And that's the piece finished, for now. A very simple, cylindrical bottle vase with a step towards the rim that leads to a slightly more narrow opening. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.